Just maybe while we're waiting, I thank you for the land acknowledgement. I also feel it's important for us to acknowledge that we are on treaty territory as well. I believe this is Treaty 13 territory signed with the Mississaugas, and I am going to have to refer to my notes here, but it's important to acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and this is also territory covered by the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Um, and it looks like I can give it a test. Where do I have to? There we go. Okay. Down a bit. Okay. So to situate myself, now that we've situated ourselves here together, I'm Aaron Franks. I'm the research lead at the it's a new team, the Data Sovereignty Research Collaborative at the First Nations Information Governance Center. I live and work in unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. Um, I'm going to talk about First Nations data this morning. I think it's important to recognize the distinctions between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit data governance protocols, um, uh, aspirations to the ultimate, stewardship and ownership of their data. I know Métis have had principles in develop for a while, sometimes referred to as the OCAS, ownership, control, access, and stewardship principles. And our Inuit colleagues at ITK developed the National Inuit Research Strategy a few years ago now, and I believe that's going to be updated. So just to clarify things, where you may talk about Indigenous data and data sovereignty, I'm going to focus on First Nations data. Yeah, so I want to build through some ideas here, and it's going to be fairly introductory and broad and focus down on research data management as a practice. I think it's important to recognize that even in the introductory and broad, there's always something new to think about and recognize. So I encourage us all, including myself, to take a moment and sort of think through the implications of some of what we're going to talk about here. I think in relation to the rest of your program, and especially the research data management workshop that you're holding at the end of the day. I wish I could stay. I can't. But research data management, in my mind, is essentially an extension of what Indigenous peoples have been asking for and practicing themselves with their own data for a very long time. So with that, a little bit about where I work, FNIGC. The First Nations Information Governance Center is a non-for-profit. It's a apolitical technical organization, been around since 2010. We were mandated by a resolution by Chiefs in Assembly for the Assembly of First Nations in 2009, but we're not an extension of the AFN. We don't work for the AFN. That was really a call by Chiefs to establish a standing long-term capacity for First Nations in the area of data governance and data sovereignty. So the team that I work with, we're working on the highlighted bits. I've sort of bigged us up a little. Although on the right, you can see the national surveys, and that is still the sort of backbone or core of what we do, the regional health survey, among others. And you'll see there on the bottom left, the First Nations data governance strategy. Colleagues of mine are working with teams across the country developing infrastructure, which we eventually will transform into regional information governance centers. So right now, my team's doing two types of research, and that is on the sort of legislative, technical, social, regulatory, cultural elements of data sovereignty, so the sort of data ecosystem that First Nations operate in, and kind of in two ways, really recognizing that there's a real need for tools, templates, guidance in the here and now, but also recognizing that we don't know what the future is going to look like. And sometimes what feels like a pathway in terms of policy or where the government's going with funding is not where things end up. So we need to remain open, exploratory. We need to think about data in all sorts of ways. So a little bit of a breath here. What is First Nations data? I think in a lot of ways, it's almost more useful to ask, what isn't First Nations data? First Nations data, in our view, is any data or information that's collected from First Nations, is collected from their lands and waters and territories, or is about First Nations, regardless of where it's held. So, we can parse it and break it down into these categories, but ultimately it's it's any data or information from or about First Nations people, lands, waters, or territories. Often the kinds of data we talk about in our in many forms of research, and particularly around governance and administration, would be data about First Nations. And that's, you might categorize that as sort of quantitative data, statistically oriented data, demographic data, data that's oriented towards providing services, supporting governance and administration. I think data from First Nations is kind of any data that couldn't be from anywhere else. Like the Mi'kmaq language, Mi'kmaq stories can't come from anywhere other than Mi'kmaqi. And, repeat that story from, coast to coast to coast across, I think, 60 some distinct nations based on language and geography and territory. And of course, we recognize that there are governance structures developed, imposed by, or along with the Indian Act that recognize 600 plus First Nations bands. But we also need to think about First Nations as geographical and language groups, and not just the boundaries imposed by what is now ISK and CERNAC. And of course, lands and waters and medicines and animals data as well. So another little breath. First Nations data sovereignty. I know we often talk increasingly about Indigenous data sovereignty, but it's really important to recognize that that looks and will be different for different First peoples, not just in what's now Canada, Turtle Island, but globally. But there are some shared principles, of course. Data and information belongs to a people collectively. And I think, a modern nation state like Canada, that gets obscured a little bit, but the Canadian government certainly thinks of its government data as belonging to it as the government that represents and governs Canada. And I think in a more diffuse sense, when we think about education, the library system, access to culture and libraries and all those things that many people take for granted, there is a sense that our data and information is a collective asset. And that holds true for Indigenous peoples too. First Nations as self-governing nations and rights holders have an inherent right to govern their lands and waters and people. And this right is inherent, but it's also confirmed in a nation-to-nation relationship in Section 35 in the Constitution, the Charter of Human Rights, and also more recently through Canada's becoming a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'll try not to wave the microphone around too much so that I don't fade out for people online. And what's been brought into law, the United Nations Declarations Act. So we have, in some ways, we can build a rights-based discourse around that. But rights, when the rubber hits the road, are also about institutions and capacity. So First Nations and other Indigenous peoples can't manifest these rights, can't bring them into being without authority over their data and information. And that requires institutions like rebuilt education systems, like rebuilt governance systems, like language revitalization. So after all that, ultimately, First Nations data sovereignty means that First Nations data is governed by First Nations laws, protocols, and policies. And we'll get into the paths to action on that here pretty quick. Just a quick point on UNDRIP. UNDRIP, as a UN mechanism, of course, recognizes the human rights of all people as individuals, but it also recognizes the specific rights as a collectivity of Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples, and that they have just rights as a collective people that are integral to their development and their well-being. So, First Nations data sovereignty, the idea of collective rights. Let's talk about principles. Are people familiar with OCAP? Okay, so there's a lot of nods. This will be a kind of a refresher, but again, I think always an opportunity to sort of think through something new every time we share this information with one another. Ownership, control, access, and possession. It's been around since 1998. I'm not sure many people don't know this, but it originally was OCA 3 or 4 years before that. And that wasn't a coincidence that was the acronym chosen. This was the time of the Oka crisis or the occupation. And the letter P, possession, was sort of added a few years later as a sort of, okay, we have these principles: ownership, control, access. Possession is really important. First Nations need to be able to actually possess, in a very tangible sense, their data, and we'll get to that here in a sec. So I mean, OCAP is FNIGC has a very distinct role in stewarding the principles and raising awareness and doing education and training. But we don't own the principles. The principles are the collective property of all First Nations. So we're not here to police how First Nations want to assert their rights. But overall, I think there are ways we can point out that OCAP works. And one is as a sort of minimum standard for the sharing, protection, and use of First Nations data. Maybe not dissimilar to an ethics approach to research, although not exactly. But more than that, there's I would call it a sort of a very normative, a very small p political aspect. And that is, we're way beyond trying to minimize harm. We're in the world of First Nations benefiting first and foremost from their own data and information. So that very low bar of minimizing harm is something that I think OCAP varies from most other protocols on. And then ultimately, it's about nation building and self-determination and the development of culture. So I won't linger on this, but just a little refresher. Ownership is the right of First Nations to exercise their ownership rights over their data, regardless of where it's located. And that probably includes some of the research data centers and StatsCan's data centers and the university repositories and many other sites. Control is very broad, but I think the key thing about control is that it's really speaks to the capacity to make informed decisions about even deciding what becomes data and what's not data. I think it's really important, and everyone has to remind themselves of this, including us at FNIGC. The data's, I don't think it's just out there to be collected. Data's actually made. I mean, there's a lot of theorizing we could do about the movement between knowledge and information and data. And I know a lot of thinking's been done on that actually for sort of centuries. I mean, the people have been talking about that since in a European context, since different kinds of writing and technology has been developed, concerns or opportunities about what it means for society to create things that have data points. But anyway, I think it's important to kind of always ground ourselves in that fact that data is made, and it may not involve limitless choices, but it does involve our agency. Access, two parts to access. Of course, First Nations need to have access to their own data, but they also need to determine who else has access to those data sets. And finally, possession. I think even now, maybe especially now in the so-called digital age, First Nations have the right to possess their data and bring it into their jurisdiction, no matter where it's held. So it becomes less about, although I think this is still an option that we want to make available to First Nations, and First Nations are exercising this option to bring data on reserve, on-prem. I don't know if people are familiar with Iching First Nation and Wikwemagong on Manitoulin Island, but they've just built their own server that's housing, governing data in their own community. Where that's not an option, or where people don't want that, I think this becomes about the exercise of rights in complex data systems that are inherently sort of dispersed. So I'm going to pause there, and you can read this text. What I want to do now is just kind of think about, we're thinking about principles, and they're not standards. They're not codified into standards. But they seem to me that they're more than guidelines. They're more than a sort of set of things to refer to. They're actually building blocks to action. They're prompts for us to think about how, as I'm not First Nations myself, I'm Métis, so I don't want to pan-indigenize here, but for First Nations, these are building blocks to think through the exercise of rights. And for others, these are building blocks to think through how to respect those rights. And that's what I want to just reinforce here a little bit. Especially for us at FNIGC as stewards of the principles. For a very long time, we've sort of uh, been hearing from people in all sorts of contexts, how do I do OCAP or how can I get to OCAP? And ultimately, we sort of break it down and say it really depends on what it is you want to do. These are um, these are prompts to action. So the key thing is they're not actions themselves. And I think for non-Indigenous organizations, maybe like the CRDCN, it's really important that the principles aren't saying that you're going to respect OCAP is not a it's not a commitment in itself. It's a commitment to really respect those rights grounded in ownership, control, access, and possession. So, to kind of be blunt, we want to move OCAP and other data sovereignty principles from the preamble of we're going to commit to this into the clauses of and when we establish a server, it will have these basic requirements. And when we enter into a research agreement, it will have these requirements that First Nations determine. And they're, again, sort of banging away here. They're practical considerations for capacity building. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? Okay. Cool. So people are familiar with the FAIR principles. Obviously, I think you're talking about them quite a bit today. The CARE principles. Okay. The reason I bring this up is that, a few things. Back in back in the mid 90s, late 90s, very few people were talking about data sovereignty, full stop. I think whether, Indigenous or not. Of course, since then, governments, corporations, I mean, in some ways, the term data sovereignty has origins, and you could say it comes from this very uh, just very specific place of data residency, where it sovereignty over data becomes strictly about a sort of um, international nation states interacting with corporations to determine ultimately who has control over data in different locations. And there's a deeply, deeply, deeply sort of commercial element to that. And it's not dissimilar in a way. I don't want to go on a tangent here, but to the notion of intellectual property, where we have this rather on the one hand, intellectual property is defined as creations of the mind, and on the other hand, we have this very commercially oriented international intellectual property protocol that's essentially centered around the ownership of IP and as a sort of a trade mechanism. So data sovereignty has evolved a lot, and I think Indigenous data sovereignty is really not strictly about data residency. It's about agency, authority over the narrative of your own community. So, in a sense, just like OCAP was a response to the federal government not collecting data in a good way, or at least not sharing it, at least not engaging with First Nations in that data collection, the CARE principles were a response from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance to the standing up of the FAIR principles. So, in a sense, it's not saying uh, there's anything inherently wrong with data sharing. It just needs to be grounded in relationship, and it needs to be grounded in protocol, and it needs to be grounded in respecting the desires of communities where data is being collected for the use of their own data. And increasingly, principles like CARE and OCAP sort of speak to one another. Yeah, so principles are prompts to action. We've got here OCAP, FAIR and CARE, our friends at the Tri Council, TCPS2 Chapter 9, which is the chapter providing guidelines. Again, they're guidelines on research involving Indigenous peoples, and then quite a technical standard. Some people might be familiar with the Core Trust Seal, which is a technical standard for data repositories. So we're now in a world where standards are proliferating. We have the ISO standards, IEEE standards, and increasingly these aren't just technical standards, but they're standards for governance, and they're standards for establishing protocols. So I'm going to have a sip of water and maybe spend the last 7 or 8 minutes here on something that I know you're talking about today, and especially this afternoon, research data management. Um, Goodness. So First Nations governments and service organizations interacting with the academiverse, maybe we could call it that. All of those infrastructures. And I think, the story here is just like there's a proliferation of standards now, federally especially, there's a proliferation of infrastructure developments, of policy developments. We see fora for discussion. We see institutions like the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, um, longstanding institutions like the Standards Council of Canada, and many sort of all interacting. Um, we see federal government imperatives around standing up digital research infrastructure. I think by and large, we see not nearly enough engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people on the development of these infrastructures and policies. And this is some of the work that FNIGC does. If you can imagine a sort of First Nation, and First Nation is not a monolith. First Nations are not only a community, there are also institutions, education, government, research. Often they're very overstretched and very underfunded institutions. But facing all of these silos and these, functions inside a university, Office of Research Services, commercialization of intellectual property is a huge one. And then we think of data, it's not just research data, it's all the data associated with education itself, which I think often gets overlooked. Students' data. We talk about Indigenous content in a university context. How does a community govern and oversee the use of traditional knowledge and elders' knowledge in a classroom? Because it's not research per se. No one necessarily went and got a grant to do that and interview this elder. And then we have research data management, which ironically is, I think, essentially what First Nations and other Indigenous peoples have been calling for, have been asking institutions to do for a very long time. It's like, you collect this data. What are your protocols and processes for caring for it, stewarding it, ensuring that maximum benefit from it accrues to people? And it's true. I think RDM as a policy or a paradigm is really designed to serve the research community. And I think we really need to think about that research community much more expansively to include communities, not just as subjects, but as actual research partners and people who do research themselves. This, I just wanted to point out, some of the active verbs here. RDM is about the active planning and organization of data throughout its entire life cycle, and it includes the whole bundle of policies and protocols and practices. So we also got a Short Connections grant, maybe the year before you guys did. So we have institutional eligibility. We are not a university. All of the assumptions that the tri-agencies make about the resources available to a research institution don't apply to us. So we're constantly scrambling around how to make up those gaps. And we're always in conversation with them about how to improve, to break down barriers. So yes, you can see here, I don't want to dwell super on the details just in the interest of time. But our project was called Asserting and Respecting First Nations and Nunatsiavut, because we had a couple of participants from the Nunatsiavut government, data sovereignty and research data management. Essentially, and we all know Connections funding is fairly modest, use it to host 4 virtual dialogues. A lot of the money went to paying honoraria, and as well as preparing a report. We had 6 academic institutions. We had 4 Indigenous partner sets of participants. Unfortunately, one of them had to drop out. And we hosted 4 virtual dialogues. And the main goals were building relationships and exploring the assumptions, exploring the taken for granted, and kind of picking those apart. And this was especially important for the academic participants, breaking down their assumptions about research data management and how effective it can be, or what's missing when it comes to working with First Peoples, the elements and issues of RDM, and then identifying steps to action. So what participants told us, the report is still with participants in order to have them approve any quoted material, so I can't really quote from the report. But it's kind of divided some points down here into two kind of categories. One focused on understanding, so levels of knowledge, and again, these assumptions. Communication must continue throughout the life cycle of data. So that is essentially pre-project and not just post-project, but I mean, a project has an end life. We report on it and we submit our financials. What about the data that's collected from the project? How do we, without imposing a burden on the community to say, we're going to email you every week and tell you how your data is, a protocol in place to say, we in our project design, we've accounted for the lifespan of the data. Relationships and rights need to be clearly defined. This is a key specific one, actually. A growing number of institutionally based researchers are feeling keenly their obligation to the data sovereignty of people that they work with, but they find they don't have any institutional support. They find that I think it's not just a lack of education and training. It's sort of a deeper set of barriers around the in behind of, well, you can't do this because of certain legal obligations that we have, maybe through the commercialization office, or you can't do this because the tribe policy administrative policies don't allow you to pay people in a particular way. But I think it goes even deeper than that. What we kept hearing was, people work according to disciplinary norms. So if you're an ice core collecting cryo scientist, or you're a literary I'm making things up here, but imagine the whole panorama of disciplines. So we have these disciplinary norms, some of them really long-standing and often inherited from Europe or the United States, and then we have these infrastructures around data governance, data retention. We have these government imperatives to stand up digital research infrastructure. Everyone's supposed to have a strategy now. All researchers are supposed to have research data management plans, but we still have these disciplinary norms of, well, in my discipline, I publish like this, or in my discipline, I treat data like this. So people are feeling unsupported and frankly, not incentivized. Like, what is the incentive for a lone researcher or a small team to say, I'm working with this community, this is what we're hearing from them. We want to do the right thing by this community, but by the metrics of my career advancement, by the metrics of what the university expects of me, and by the metrics of what the Canadian Society of Cryogenic whatever expects of me, there's no incentive to really respect their rights. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. And then action, capacity issues. And I think the key thing here is that they're both institutional and in community. And we don't want institutional capacity to get past community capacity, because what that means then is that we have very well-meaning offices of research services or whoever saying, we've nailed it, we've developed this policy, and local First Nations going, well, we're not there yet in terms of our own infrastructure. So if you want to work with us, we need to walk together. More flexibility in policies and processes. And this is, building capacity in single communities alone is only one element of building community capacity. And this is something we heard more from our Indigenous participants, but I think it's important for everybody, that horizontal collaboration between First Nations and other between Indigenous nations is really, really important for building long-term capacity. And I think non-Indigenous institutions have a huge role to play there. So, like I said, I think research data management is this kind of paradigm that, you could say, well, thanks for finally considering this, federal government and research institutions. We've been asking for, more attention to the management of data, but not just for the research community, but for your Indigenous partners. And we're playing with the language here a little bit and playing with this idea of management as a discourse, and in our own way, sort of internally, kind of trying to shift the discourse and working with some funders, including the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, to promote RDM as MDR. So institutional research data management essentially is focused on the federally funded or professional research community, better operationalizing data in the research community, making data in relation is from the Indigenous community perspective. So data is not just found and then managed, it's created and cared for with continuous attention to the communities, to the context of the community's reality and their governance needs. So, a little bit watch this space. Hopefully, RDM as MDR is something you might hear more of. How am I close to the end here? Yeah. Okay. You know what? One quick point, examples of us using OCAP in our work, in some ways it breaks down into two main things. First Nations ownership of their own data when we work with First Nations and when we work with partners who work with First Nations. The other is clear research data management, is that more fine-grained approach to explaining, providing opportunities, providing touch points, being clear about how we are caring for data with our partners, and then trying to avoid legalese wherever possible and providing sufficient explanations and context. Yeah, so thanks very much. I don't think it's question time here. We're going to move on, but I'm around at least until about 1 o'clock, and maybe we can chat over lunch. And I appreciate your listening, and I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.